about frameworks, the good, the dangers, and how to avoid making mistakes. The reason I've not said the good, the bad, is because I've sort of come to believe there's nothing bad about using frameworks if they're used properly. So as I've said, I'm Alex. If you've got nothing better to do with your life, follow me on Twitter. I'm a web developer for mainly front-end kind of stuff. I work in the back end with free marker, sort of bridging the gap between Java and the stuff we do on the front end. So, first of all, is anyone here that uses frameworks sort of actively or has used frameworks before? Cool, okay. Anyone that doesn't use frameworks because they think they're not a good idea? Cool, okay, that's fine. Cool, so yeah, frameworks generally often ready to use build code for specific languages. I'm talking front end and back end today. So we're not going into sort of any other frameworks, design frameworks. I'll be talking sort of back end, mainly referring to Laravel, which is a PHP framework, and Bootstrap, because I can sort of pick things out of these frameworks to talk about. So we use them, it's basically just to improve or aid development in some way. So obviously there's a massive general area to this, but generally we use it to either improve or just speed up development, but we'll talk about that more. So the dangers, we say dangers because there's danger of misusing frameworks. I don't think there's any actual negatives frameworks as such, except probably if you've got negatives within a particular framework you're working with, so inaccurate code, security vulnerability, stuff like that. But the point is that we can sort of iron them out along the way. So the first thing I think really good about frameworks is rapid prototyping. If you've got an idea and you want to get that onto paper as sort of per se, and you want to go ahead and just get your ideas out there, start writing them down, get users using your product. You're working as part of sort of the lean model of I'm going to give this to my users and get some sort of feedback. So that could be either just front end, or that could be sort of adding the dynamics in the back end as well. Yeah, so if you've got an idea and you need to get some feedback on it, it's perfect for that because you can quickly get that sort of that idea out there. Secondly, code and design consistency. Now, when you're working either on your own, with one other person, a massive team, or hundreds of people, your aim is consistency. Just because you're working on your own as well doesn't mean you're not going to achieve consistency, because you might forget something you did 2 weeks ago and either rebuild it or build on it in a slightly different or wrong way. So as working on your own or as part of a team, it's a good idea to sort of have that consistency within a framework, and we'll come on to sort of the documentation a bit later. That really helps if you're working within a team. And obviously I'm not just referring to frameworks that are out there and ready built for you that you can just go and download. You could have your own framework as part of an organisation just yourself, so you could build up your own framework and reuse it. And if you document that is even better. Yeah. So if you are going to go over to the web and just grab a framework that's already built for you, you'll often find there's enthusiastic communities that sort of are active in the development of stuff and how it's documented, and also people that are literally there just to help you. So it can be a good learning curve as well. We're looking a bit about some bad stuff about why frameworks aren't so good for beginners. But generally, you've got this good community of people that can really help you out, and people that are really enthusiastic about that particular framework. So it's good to sort of be able to jump over and get help with stuff, as well as actually participate. So yeah, as I've already said, I've already sort of gone into the fact that it's documented for you. So if you're working as part of a team, I know where I work, we document everything we do. So if we have style guides, for example, we know exactly what we need to build on. We know what modules we can sort of fit together on the front end to keep the design consistent, especially for new people that are brought onto a team, or people that are at a sort of lower level than other people. So specifically referring to PHP, I don't know, does anyone here develop in PHP? Is that? Yeah, that's all right then. So you'll probably already know that PHP is massively inconsistent in the way that it names functions, in the way that it's generally designed. It's a bit like JavaScript in the way that if you know how to utilize it really well, you could make a really, really good job of it using patterns. But for PHP, like I said, I'm specifically speaking about Laravel, it's perfect because it completely abstracts all the bad stuff from the language. I think I've got an example here. The first one here, we've got a snippet of code that would string a post if it's greater than 100 characters, and add your ellipsis and otherwise just not post out. But in Laravel, we get this sort of common string model that we can just say, we'll limit this, and that will do everything there for you. Now moving down, we've got exactly the same thing. We've got str to upper, str to lower, which is obvious, but we've also got UC words, which does something to a string, but is named sort of completely differently. So it's abstracting that and giving it sort of common grounds to work with. And the benefit there is that it's easier to learn the language as well. So you can learn things a lot quicker if you're working with things that actually make sense. The same here as well, we've just got a function in PHP. Again, we can see underscores where they're missing, so it's again inconsistent, but that abstracts that. We've got our file model, makes sense. We can put or append things to files. So that's another thing that's good. So what can be dangerous about frameworks? Well, visual-heavy front-end frameworks can make sites look really generic. Anyone worked with Bootstrap before? If you go to a website and you see something that looks bootstrappy, you go, oh, like, it looks a bit shit. So I'm guilty of this, massively guilty of this, and I still sometimes, when I'm releasing a product early, it will look a bit generic. And that's a massive problem because people don't sort of take the time to say, oh, you know, I'm going to sort of tweak this to my own needs. I've got a little example of a site that I found, no idea what it is, but it looks like just Bootstrap, and you can tell it's built on Bootstrap. I don't think it's bad that you can tell a site's built on Bootstrap, but I found another site which is built on Bootstrap, which I think looks pretty decent. It's got a unique look and feel to it. You know, someone that's familiar with Bootstrap would be able to tell, but otherwise it looks good. The second point is code bloat, and this refers to the back and front end. Downloading things that you're not going to use is ridiculous, and using things that you're not going to use. I've seen examples of particularly Bootstrap sites that use, you know, we've got two style sheets, we've got bootstrap.css and bootstrap responsive.css. And then maybe 8 or 9 script includes for plugins that may or may not be used. So you're creating HTTP requests for no reason. The main problem for this is education. People sort of, you know, take it from the documentation and don't understand, you know, why it's there and don't sort of understand the implications of it. Same with the back end. If you've got stuff loaded in, now this varies depending on the framework that you're using, but you know, if you've got a framework that's loading in a load of crap that you don't need, you know, that's bad. The third point is quite a big one. It's assumed stability, security and speed amongst other bits and bobs. But yeah, so I mean, people download frameworks thinking that they're just a perfect package to use, and you know, this is wonderful, and you know, I don't need to bother escaping output or anything like that. And again, I'm guilty of it, as I'm sure other people are, but that's the problem. You know, people see this wonderful package, how it's advertised on the site. Frameworks tend to have this lovely splash with, this is what this framework can do. And it sort of gives the impression that, you know, you're downloading something that is just going to work and you don't need to really worry about anything. And that sort of brings on to the point that it can abstract. We talked about it abstracting for good reasons, but it can abstract so much from an actual, you know, the vanilla code, that we forget to actually bother to learn and keep up with the code that we're writing this thing on. You know, if you're working with Laravel, you're working with PHP, I look back at PHP and go, oh, you know, I can't be bothered. But really, you know, you've got to keep up with the kind of flow of development on that side of things as well. Because at the end of the day, you're still writing in that language, but you're just writing perhaps a better version of it or something that you're going to work quicker with. So frameworks, you know, tend to use sort of MVC, and it's easier to abuse if you're not creating something within the realms of a framework, or you're very inexperienced and you think that just using a framework is going to make you a better developer. then that's bad. So it's easy to abuse in that respect. So, you know, I could name numerous examples, but you know, things like not following MVC, model views controllers, and stuff like that. And of course, you might be using functionality, vanilla functionality, that's available in the framework. So it's sort of mixing things up a bit as well. So there is a kind of tendency to have to learn the framework, but again, that's pretty obvious. So, let's just get past them. What can we do to actually use frameworks well if we're going to actually make use of them? Generators, mainly for front-end stuff, but use a generator to actually pick and choose the bits that you're actually going to use from the language. I know Bootstrap has one, but you could do more than that generator. That's the point as well. Generators, you know, will change colours for you and remove plugins that you might not use, or remove parts of the CSS that you might not use. But still, it makes sense to actually get to know it and strip out the bits that you don't need. And again, get to know your framework inside out. If you're using code, someone else's code, or code within a company that you've perhaps joined and the framework's available, then why wouldn't you get to know that code? You're essentially then just taking code and just making use of it without making sense of it, and that, you know, it doesn't make sense. And keeping within best practices as well. That's within the framework and within the language that you're working with as well. So you wouldn't just say, I'll download Bootstrap, stick it on my site, build a nice design, and then, you know, completely, you know, say in an entirely new style sheet, start writing out things and coming away from the sort of modular sense of Bootstrap, because it's very modular in the sense that you can literally put together a site like a jigsaw, and you just put the building blocks in. So you need to sort of keep within best practices. That comes with some knowledge of what you're doing as well, some knowledge of the language as well. But generally, if you look at the documentation of a framework and you actually analyse it, like we've said, get to know it well, then you'll sort of, you know, stick to that in that sense. And also continue to research language security, best practices, core updates, deprecations, stuff like that. It's about sort of staying a developer in that core sense, but making use of the framework for the sort of benefits it gives. And obviously update the actual code that you're using when and where it's available. A massive problem is that you have code, you know, you're using code, particularly on the back end of a site. What happens when a security vulnerability comes up? You know, you've got then thousands and thousands of people that you know and understand that security vulnerability, and we've seen this in plenty of mass you know, announcements of security. You know, people scramble together, making sure people are updating stuff, and that can become a real problem. So you have to keep on top of actually updating, you know, whatever framework that you're using. Getting involved in the community as well is a really good way to sort of increase your knowledge, report, you know, bugs, improvements, things that you'd like to see, things that you know that other people would like to see. You know, just generally getting involved in what you're actually working with. Because again, if you're pulling someone else's code, using it, and then going, oh, don't care, you know, it's sort of not, you know, giving credit to who's actually built that. So it's good to sort of get involved with people and sort of get involved in the community, help people out. Helping people is a really good way to learn as well. So that was fairly short, but thanks for listening, and I hope you have got room to say to people, this is why you should use frameworks. Cool. Any questions at all? Yes.
Strange. The most dangerous thing you didn't mention, which is the fact that sooner or later, when you use a framework, you will have to make some customization, personalization, or whatever, sure, because your website solution, whatever, you need to get a little snippet from where you are.
Yeah.
I think this is the best. The worst, not the worst, it's a risk, a danger that you have to face as a developer when you use a framework, because you're faster at the beginning, but then you have a technical debt later.
Absolutely.
And especially with the updates, because at a certain point you say, if I update, I break something, no, I don't update.
Sure.
And so I think this is the most peculiar thing of using a framework.
Yeah, I totally understand that. I think the fact, sort of getting back to understanding how the framework works is a really important part of it. let's say you'd written that framework, which is a good idea in practice anyway. You know, it's good to have a sort of solid base of what you're doing, organise your code and everything like that. If you build your own framework then, and you're updating it, if you get to know the framework that you're using, you're in the sort of the same position. If an update comes out, you can sort of, you know, perhaps apply them updates as, you know, as a sort of knowledgeable person of that code. It does make it difficult. There are obviously easy ways to do things like that, but no, I totally see your point. That's a good point. Any others?
What's the difference between like frameworks and PHP libraries like jQuery and JavaScript and preprocessors and CSS? Because functionally they seem very similar.
Yeah, it's sort of like a very vague area. Things are, you know, people say, you know, don't refer to this kind of thing as a framework. I've seen CSS grid systems where people say, yeah, this is a framework, but then I've seen others that say, we are not a framework. So there's sort of not a definitive way to define our framework. Libraries, again, perhaps slightly different, because if I load up, you know, if I need to develop some cool JavaScript functionality, the first thing I think about is jQuery. It's subtracted from JavaScript, and I use that solely. Obviously, I have to mix JavaScript in, but it's the same with a PHP framework. I use the framework, but there might be a function that isn't replaced, so I still have to use that. I think, yeah, it's a difficult one to answer because I think it varies depending on, you know, the author's opinions and the people that use it, and also the complexity of it as well, and the way it's sort of built up. But I'd probably say jQuery is sort of defined as a library, but in a sense, yeah, you know, it's a framework to build things on. The difference is here that it's not, you don't sort of place it where you need it and then build on top of it. You just use jQuery as a replacement for JavaScript as such. It's a library that you would sort of use in that sense. That makes sense. Yeah, it's more of sort of a foundation of what you're using, but you know, you get JavaScript libraries that are referred to as frameworks as well, despite the fact they are libraries. So, you know, who knows? But that's a good way to put it. Yeah. Cool. Yes.
Yeah, thanks. Anyway, I do subscribe to your videos on YouTube.
Oh right. Okay.
Yeah, I
cool.
do follow most of the stuff you do on YouTube as well. But from your YouTube videos, you have to mention things like frameworks.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah. And the other question I'd like to ask: why would someone want to use, for instance, Zen framework for PHP, rather than use, say, .NET framework, which is a whole package on its own, easy to download, and you can use any of these languages. For instance, you can use PHP, or you can use VB.NET, or you can use C#.
I think I'll answer it in terms of, say, PHP frameworks. If you think about it this way, anyone can build a framework. You know, anyone can build a framework, host it, have people contribute to it, and say, use this framework because we're fast, we can do this, we can do that. I think the main thing is personal preference and what suits your application. I guess this sort of ties into the problem of how do you know 2 years down the line what your application needs are going to be. So if you pick a framework now, it might not be suitable in the future. So, you know, that could be a problem. But I guess the way you can look at it is that if you are in desperate need of a change in the future, you could choose another framework and build on top of that. There's plenty of site applications that do rebuilds based on their changing needs. So I think with a framework, pick something that you feel comfortable with and that you feel that will meet your needs. Don't go overkill. For a simple application, you know, some frameworks aren't going to be suitable. For a beginner, Laravel's perfect because it's just so intuitive. You know, you could just use it straight out of the box. It's brilliant. But yeah, I mean, it's personal preference and what you need. The key probably is to just research exactly what you need before you actually do anything with it. Because probably another danger would be to just go, oh yeah, all my friends are using that, I'll use it as well. Yeah. Cool. Any other questions? Yes.
Framework, I mean, a lot of frameworks.
Cool, yeah.
But one of the things, I think, frameworks sometimes take a lot, in my opinion, and I like to know what you think, well. I think frameworks take a lot out of the actual, whether it be CSS or PHP or what you're doing. I think yes, it does make things easier, but that has a lot of stuff to be forgotten almost. When you're doing things like the CSS, for example, when you do things like one of the best things about CSS is inheritance, for example. You know, when you're looking at things like we talk about SAS, and, you know, it doesn't do that, do those sort of things. Well, it attempts to do things well with like extend and all this kind of stuff, but you know, a lot of the time because we use a framework where we're creating it ourselves, and we sort of came to the conclusion that inheritance isn't working very well here, you know, because all we're creating, doing a lot of templating stuff. Sort of like one size fits all, change a couple of variables and kind of recite kind of thing.
Yeah.
There's a lot of cascading going on. So the inheritance is a very important thing. You know, I feel the frameworks you sort of have to pull out what you think is best, and leave out what you don't. As you said, you know, bootstrap and that kind of thing. You know, what are your thoughts on that? I mean, do you think it's something that can replace? Because you sort of say this particular framework is good for beginners, they can sort of just go in and do it all. But I think what we're missing there is there should be a very strong, well, there should be a foundation and a continual growth in whatever language it is that's within it.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I mean, I wouldn't by any means say to replace learning a language using a framework. It'd be silly. But how many people start learning JavaScript and jQuery? I know we're not talking specifically framework; it's a library. But when there's a handful of people that refer to jQuery as they think there's a difference between JavaScript and jQuery, when fundamentally there isn't. I think in terms of being able to sort of say, using like you said, you use a framework at work, you're building it yourself. Building something yourself or analysing a framework so much that you can change it if you need, you're starting with that fundamental understanding of it. For a beginner, learn the core. That's really, really important. Learn CSS before you start playing around with things like that. But again, it sort of varies based on needs as well. Like I said, if you want to prototype and you're comfortable knowing, you know CSS, you know how to write, semantic markup, but you need to quickly, build something. You can knock something out with Bootstrap, for example. But definitely advocate of building your own framework within, your company. You can sort of test your needs then. But if you think about it in that sense, once you've built your framework as part of a team in a company and someone new joins, that's completely new to them. You've just recycled it. It's exactly the same thing as just taking codes from somewhere else. I think the danger, though, within building something within a company would be that it might not be documented properly. Whereas if you plan to release something out in the wild, you want it documented, you want people to start using it. So I think there's dangers in all respect of things, but I think you've just, at the end of the day, got to think about, making sure that people use what is available properly, learn the fundamentals, absolutely, definitely. Hopefully that answered your question.
Yeah, no.
Cool. Anything else? Yes.
I completely agree with you when you say to use frameworks like Twitter, Bootstrap, or Foundation to get a prototype out quickly. Would you, say if you had your prototype working and it's looking great and you put some customization on it, would you stick with the framework to go to a production website, or would you back out the framework and then just go with your own stuff, write your own CSS and get all your different plugins and so on? Would you?
Well, it depends. The point of prototyping is to find out if people actually want to use something, or if they like the way it looks, they like the way it functions, they actually like the product itself. So if you've prototyped and you've you can prove, I'm not a UX or analytics expert, but if you can prove that people are using your product and it's doing well, then really you don't need to change anything. You'd obviously change, perhaps perhaps in the future. Again, it's personal preference. If you want to stick with something that you're comfortable with and you know, or if you think actually our application is a bit more high dependency, we need to move from Laravel to Zend, or from Bootstrap to just the 960 grid system, and then we're going to completely restructure our design. It's that kind of situation. There's no answer to the question because needs vary, outcomes vary once you've got that initial prototype up. So it's really whatever makes sense and whatever comfortable. Yeah. Cool. Any other questions? Cool. Okay.